All right, so yeah, so again, thanks everybody for joining. We are here to talk about if the FAIR for Research software principles are working, and to some extent how we will know that and what we maybe can do about that. And specifically, one way of looking at this is, have they been useful? Have they been usable? And if not, what do we need to change to make them work? So in order to do this, we're going to talk about software and research, the original FAIR principles that sometimes we call the FAIR data principles, at least in the software community, and then the FAIR principles for software themselves. And then we'll talk a little bit about where we are now and where we go from here. So I'm Dan Katz from University of Illinois, and Moran Grunpeter from Software Heritage is also here, and we'll together go through this. We have a number of co-chairs as well who are helping us do this, or maybe co-doing this with us is a better way of saying that. So I will turn it over to Moran to start off here.
Thank you, Dan. And I'm very happy that we are doing that and that you are very, well, there's a lot of people here. So I'm going to start with the research software. Within the work of FAIR for research software, we have defined research software in a certain way that you see on the slide. Research software includes source code files, algorithms, scripts, computational workflows, and executables that were created during the research process or for a research purpose. And we differentiate that from software in research. We kept out of scope services and instantiated software. Now, in the next slide, we show that research software, so Dan, next slide, please. Yes, we show that research software is not created in isolation. It can be part of a very large software stack. And if you look at the diagram on the right, it's the Conrad hinted software collapse, showing that actually the research software is really at the top of this kind of pyramid of artifacts. And it's we need everything to reproduce and reuse software. Now, when we think of research software and the FAIR data principles, so next slide, then, please. What are the FAIR data principles? I'm not going to redo the data principles with you with findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, but I do want to highlight that the principles were high-level guiding schema and do not suggest any specific technology standard or implementation solution. And we took that same road. So just to say that it was created in 2016, now we're 2024, so maybe there's also needs some reviewing on that part, but we are reviewing now only the FAIR for research software principles. Next. This is once yours, Dan.
Okay, thank you. It's very exciting when we have to tell each other whose turn it is. So we're in terms of the original FAIR guiding principles, which again sometimes we call the FAIR data principles, and we'll say why, as on the slide in the next couple, is that these principles themselves are important in a bunch of different areas, in services and metrics and in policies, and these principles have become widely recognized and broadly adopted. And if you say FAIR to a subset of people in the research community, they immediately know what you mean, and then there's actually probably a larger set that still doesn't know what we mean, but that's a different issue that we need to also still work on. The principles themselves are tailored for metadata and data, and this term with meta in parentheses and then data is used in a number of the principles, probably the majority of them. And I think the key thing here is that even though it says on the bottom, the FAIR principles can be equally applied to non-data assets, when you look at the principles themselves, they actually say metadata and data. They don't say assets in general. And there's minimal mention of applicability to other things like workflows or services or non-data. But I will say that the paper itself does say that it's important to work with those other assets. So we'll now go on and talk a little bit more about the FAIR principles for software themselves. And as we were saying, in some sense, if you look at the FAIR principles, the original FAIR data principles, there's a little bit of a gap in terms of things that aren't data, and specifically software in this case. So research software is clearly an output in the scholarly ecosystem, and it's clearly an important part of how research is done. As we said, there's this idea that there are different kinds of output, and the original paper mentions this, but doesn't actually go forward and do anything, I would say, useful with them, other than mentioning it. And if you look at the FAIR data principles and how they actually come about, if you want to follow those principles, there are roles for the dataset creator and for repositories effectively. And those two entities are responsible collectively for creating and annotating and indexing and preserving and sharing the data sets and their metadata. But software is a little bit different. You can store software as data, but it isn't just data. It has a bunch of different properties from being executable to being readable to, in some ways, kind of being language, to being subject to copyright, unlike data, to having different licenses to other things. And so the high-level goals of making research software findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable are mostly the same as they are for data. The details on how they're actually implemented really aren't. So back to Moran.
Yes, stressing this point why software is not just another type of data. We have here two different citations. The first from the 6th recommendation for implementation of FAIR practices, recognizing that the FAIR guidelines will require translation for the digital objects, and the other one that we need to make sure the specific nature of software is recognized and not considered as just data. So this is exactly what we wanted to do, and this is the why behind a specific set of guidelines or principles, not guidelines, principles for FAIR for research software. And if we move on to the next slide, FAIR is really, well, I would always say that FAIR is not enough, but this is my personal view on things. And if you look at this diagram or figure from the article from 2021, taking a fresh look at FAIR for research software, there is a way to see how our software can be increasingly open, and that open science and open is not just FAIR, it's much more than FAIR. FAIR can be achieved on this fourth block. So if you go from left to right with identifiable, with FAIR metadata, then FAIR metadata, and restricted access, so you can have the metadata, you know, and you have an executable with a license, but as it's restricted. Then you move to the fourth one, which is FAIR, where you have full access to a software executable and FAIR metadata, but you don't have access to the source code. And moving on to having access to the source code and having the source code archived, and also all the software stack that I've just introduced in the beginning, this is going towards reproducibility, which you can't actually have with just the FAIR principles. On the next slide, we have this question of who is responsible for FAIR software, who is expected to apply FAIR, and how do we make this change in the landscape, in the scholarly ecosystem? Where should it start? So here in this adoption cycle, which is adapted from the Nosek pyramid by, the Brian Nosek pyramid that you might already know, it's an effort that we can do within the communities with the principles, but we need also to make it on other levels by making it rewarding, making it required, making it possible with infrastructures that provide these opportunities, and creating training and tools to make it easy. Now to you, Dan.
Okay, thank you. So the FAIR for research software work was relatively fast, but it was in the context of other work around research software. And so here we just want to talk a little bit about kind of what that context was to some extent, and then I'm actually leaving off a little bit as well. But from 2016 to 2021, there were discussions that happened in RDA plenaries about research software. There were the two working groups on the Force 11 software citation principles and then the software citation implementation of principles. There was a software source code identification working group. And in all these discussions, we talked about a bunch of different issues around research software, such as why is it important? How is it categorized? How is metadata used? What metadata should we be using? How is it cited? How is it identified? Things like that. In 2020, we released, well, the community as a whole released a software source code identification report. In 2021, there was a software citation guide that was released, actually, a number of them. And so around the same time, in between 2020 and 2022, we had this joint working group on FAIR for Research Software that was done under the Research Data Alliance, Force 11, and the Research Software Alliance. And we broke up into multiple subgroups, had lots and lots of people involved in a bunch of different ways, which we can, I think we'll talk about briefly. And at the end of roughly 18 months in 2022, we produced the FAIR Principles for Research Software. And at that time, given that this was roughly 6 years after the FAIR, original FAIR work had been done, we realized that that original work had been a set of principles, but there was no idea about who would maintain the principles or who would answer questions about them. I know, I think in 2021 or 2, I found an error in the principles, and I couldn't figure out how to actually get it resolved. And then I talked to somebody, and the GoFair website changed how the principles were listed. But it was a very opaque process where it was kind of somebody just decided, oh yeah, that makes sense. That should have been done the other way. So we'll just change it without really any community input. So we wanted to have this idea that after we created the principles, we wanted to actually work with the community to promote them, to understand how they were being used, to have a process for maintenance and a process for review. And that's where we are now, in some sense. We are doing a 2-year review to see how things work. As Moran said, also, the principles are just principles, but they're not actually guidelines or tools. And so we just wanted to mention there is also a RISA task force that's starting now called Actionable Guidelines for Making Research Software Fair. And the intent of this new task force is to turn these principles into guidelines and to actually build tooling as well and to make that tooling available. So if you're interested in that, you can go to the Research Software Alliance webpage and go under task forces, and you can see how to get involved in that. Okay, so again, where we are, where we were, we had 9 co-leaders in the FAIR for Research Software activity. We had monthly open steering committee meetings. We had about 500 people that were engaged in one way or another in reviewing and coming to webinars and such, communicating through these 3 different organizations. We had lots of different events. We tried to work within these organizations, but then also tried to go out to a bunch of other places as well. Tried to use mailing lists and webinars and Twitter at that time, back when Twitter was something that was acceptable to use. We had events that were in a bunch of different places, both physically and virtually. And we had some funding support from the Sloan Foundation and the Wellcome Trust to actually help us do these things. Around the same time, the same period, there was also the FAIR for Research Software activity that was going on. There was the FAIR for Virtual Research Environments that was going on. And there was and is a FAIR for Machine Learning interest group that is going on. And once we came up with these principles, we started looking at how they were being adopted. And at that time, we had 6 examples of where they were being adopted in policies, 3 incentives, 3 in communities, 7 in training, and 15 in infrastructure. So we seem to be moving forward. And again, here we are 2 years later, and we want to kind of see what else has happened. what newer groups have found, and if there's anything that we need to do differently at this point. So this group, at that point, then what it did again is to take this look, to define research software, to do a policy review, literature review, to do adoption support, and to come up with this governance, maintenance, and review plan. And again, these were all done effectively through separate working groups that were, in some cases, working in parallel, in other cases, working in sequence. And these groups together at the end then did deliver the FAIR Principles for Research Software, which were published by RDA in, I believe, April of 2022. So just to go through these briefly, and I don't want to go through these in great detail, but we'll just talk about them here, and then if there are questions, we can come back to these. So on the next 4 slides, basically, we're going to talk about FAIR, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. The left side is the original FAIR data principles. The right side is the FAIR for Research Software principles. It's funny, I see 2021 here, which I think should be 2022. So we might need to change that. And on the left side, we have things in green that were removed. And on the right side, and on both sides, actually, we have things effectively in bold that were either added or changed. So you can see that the findable definition, the overall findable definition, is a little bit simpler than for software than for data, and that we actually, under F1, about identifiers, added 2 new sub-principles to deal with the fact that software has components and granularity, and that's really a key part of source code. And similarly, that versions are really a key part of source code. And certainly both of these can exist for data, but they're not necessarily inherent in data. In terms of accessibility, accessibility is almost exactly the same, slightly different definition, but the basic principles are the same. It's worth mentioning when you talk about accessibility in software, sometimes people think about accessibility as meaning, can people with disabilities or different abilities actually access the software? And that's not what we mean by accessibility. It's a much more general, can the software be accessed by anyone? In terms of interoperability, we really, and actually reusability, we really changed these quite a lot because the definitions of interoperability and reusability in the FAIR data principles actually overlap when applied to software. And so we pulled them apart for software, and we defined interoperability as the capacity of software to, independent software to exchange data, which is, again, part of what was meant in the FAIR data principles. And for reusability, we talked about reusability as the ability to execute and inspect and understand the software so that it can be modified and built upon and incorporated into other software. So these are not, I would say in spirit, these are not so different than the FAIR data principles, corresponding principles, but they're a little bit different in how we've chosen to divide them up. And it's also worth mentioning that for software, we have to talk about usable as well as reusable. And for data, we don't have to make that same exact distinction. So again, we can come back to these when we get done. We're trying to leave a lot of time for questions. But now we'll go on to just where we are and where we're going. So as we said, in the governance working group and in the principles themselves, we said after 2 years, a broadly consultative and open review will be conducted to consider if the form of the principles are still appropriate in meeting the aims of the community. And if that review finds that we have something that needs to be done, we'll update the text and explain why the principles are either being abandoned or replaced or altered or whatever, and why we're doing that. So we're doing this review now. This is part of the RDA software source code interest group that Moran is either co-leading or very heavily involved with. I can't remember which is the official term.
Yes,
okay.
Co-chairing. Yes, that's the term, co-chair. Yeah, and
okay.
if you want, I can say a few words about the software source code interest group, and then move to the research task force.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, good. So everyone can join the software source code interest group. The FAIR4RS software principles are maintained there. We had a few sessions during the last few years presenting the FAIR4RS software principles and having some different activities around that. And we will continue. I think that the next well, I'm not sure yet because we haven't submitted anything for the next plenary, which will be an online plenary, but we might use what we have taken from this review into this next session for the software source code interest group. So feel free to join the discussion through this mailing list. And also, it's not very busy in terms of mails. You don't receive mails every week, even every two months. Maybe you can receive an email, and it's a good place to be. And that's why we also chose this as the maintenance group for the FAIR4RS software principles. And you have this new RISA task force. So then introduce that in the beginning. Don't know if we have the link, but you can go to the webpage of the RISA task force and the RISA website and get the task force there.
Right. I'm not even completely sure if it's listed in the task forces yet. We were just talking yesterday about the definition and what text to put there. So it may not be listed yet, but it will be soon. But the software source code interest group is the easiest thing to join to get involved. Yes. Just to mention, the RDA working groups are fixed term, 18 months, whereas interest groups continue, which is another part of the reason that we thought the interest group was a better home than the working group, which really was ending. Okay, so in terms of the review process, I'm assuming there's no star hidden under this graphic, so I'm going to talk about this. The questions that we're really asking are there things that need to be changed? And if so, kind of what's the schedule by which we should be doing this? And so we have a survey that's a Google form, and I think Moran has been posting that in this chat. And we've been trying to circulate it through lots of different channels as well. Effectively, it's asking a few different questions about have you used the principles, what's worked, what hasn't, things like that. And I know we've had a number of responses already. We urge you to fill out the survey, whether or not you ask questions or discuss anything here once we finish in the next couple of slides, because we're really using that to try to capture this, and then we'll do an analysis of that and try to figure out what actually comes next. And we will also, of course, share the results of that survey through a number of the channels that we've used to try to advertise these webinars and the survey itself. So what we'd like to ask is, in addition to actually doing the survey, to help us. If you know of other people, please help spread the word. We've been using a number of different social media channels, all the current ones. We've been trying to work through RSE communities, through a number of different community organizations, funding organizations, things like that, through a number of projects that are relevant, and through different kinds of adopters. And again, basically the questions in the survey is what is understandable or what is difficult, what is easy or hard to adopt or adapt, and if and when this process should happen again, assuming that we're going to do something and finish it kind of early next year. And that's all that we were going to present. And so at this point, we can stop sharing slides and open it up for questions or any discussion. So if anybody would like to say anything, please either use the hand feature or maybe even just start talking. And maybe everything is remarkably clear?
Remarkably clear. Maybe I can jump in with a question, but I don't think that we have an answer for that. My question would be, what would be the outcome of this survey. So we have started collecting the answers, and we already know that we have a few, and we would need your help to continue in completing the survey. But then, what will be the next step? So I'm asking you, Dan, but I know that we didn't decide yet on that. But if you have any ideas, what would you like to do after the survey with the survey's responses? Would be interesting to discuss that.
Yeah, I guess my hope is that the survey responses are generally positive, and maybe there's a couple of things that we have to change wording about that aren't clear, but that the principles themselves are generally seen as useful and usable as they are. And if that's the case, then really we don't do really anything else, and we just push work onto that new task force that's trying to work on software and tools to actually help people use the principles and to turn the principles into checklists. There's a little bit of a question about if that's going to be how much of that is going to be general and how much of that might be discipline or community specific. It's probably a mix, and hopefully it's more general than more community specific, but that's what that group will try to work on and find out.
Thank you, Dan.
Any questions from anyone? Well, if not, this can be a very good use of time.
I have a question for the group, though, about people that have been. So we have the survey, and I do hope that people will go to the survey and use it because we need the results from that. But if someone here want to share in the chat or share, open up the microphone and share how they are using the FAIR principles in their organization, that would be very interesting to kind of discuss that, that it is used, that the FAIR principles for research software are used.
I mean, I see Anelda turned on your camera, so I don't know if that was an indication that you were planning to say something. Okay, you've been typing. Okay, so do you want to just say that? Because
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much for the session. It's very interesting and speaks very well also to the series that we're running with RSE Africa and RSE Asia on how research software relates to the open science movement as well. So my question was, if you have had any involvement in the project or the working groups or any of the interest groups that you've been talking about from Africa, and if you've had any feedback in your survey from Africa. I don't know if it captures that. And yeah, just have you seen any African involvement in this?
Yeah. So I'll just say, and then Moran, maybe if you have anything to add. I have to say that I do not remember any specific responses from people in Africa. On the other hand, I don't not remember any either. There were a lot of people that were attending, and we don't necessarily know where a lot of people were coming from. And I don't think in the survey we actually are getting any geographic information, as far as I know. It's pretty anonymous, so I don't think we can answer that question. I mean, I will say that unfortunately, like a lot of things that are going on in the let's say RDA and RISA and even forced community, there is a lack of representation from Africa, and actually from parts of Asia as well, and from a lot of South America also. And in some sense, we have a group where a lot of the participants are Europe or North America or Australia. So I would expect that we've been similar here in terms of having more responses from those regions. Yeah, but that's anecdotal. I don't actually know. If you can certainly help in terms of reaching out to more people in your network, that would be great in terms of getting responses. Yeah, it's I guess the only thing I can say is that we are trying, but how well we're succeeding, I don't know. Let's see. So maybe Alexander, you had your hand up, and then we'll go to John's comments next.
Yes, hi. Thank you. Maureen was asking how we speak about the FAIR principles in our organizations, and whenever I introduce them or mention them, then in the context of assessment schemes, and it is, or evaluation schemes, and the FAIR principles are one of, let's say, many possible research output assessment schemes. And that's how we, or at least I, in my organization and context, mention them, talk about them. And I find that some funding organizations already recommend that, and that's what I also mentioned, and they may make that mandatory in the future, but that is in the for future users to see. I wanted to add, I recently participated in a workshop where automatic assessment of FAIR data was tried using 4 more or less popular tools. One, I think the most popular is Fuji, and I think they also I've seen attempts to expand automatic assessment to FAIR research software, so the fairness of research software, and that may not be trivial or even more complex than for FAIR data. So if I wanted to change anything about the current principles, I just would add a sentence of caution. Be cautious with automatic assessment, because it's hard to put that or the principles into checklists. And maybe another sentence that FAIR does not mean open, because that's something I have to repeat over and over again when I talk about it, but that's all I want to say. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Alexander. And again, I hope you can fill out the survey and say those 2 things in there as well, because that's how we'll capture it for further analysis. Let's see, John, you commented on a couple things. You want to say those, if you don't mind, again, for the purpose of the recording, which won't capture the chat necessarily?
Sure thing. Yeah, so I just comment that I'm at NIST in the US, and NIST has been very involved in FAIR principles for many years for data, but not engaged in software to the best of my knowledge until very recently. But I just saw in going through the membership list on the interest group that Gretchen Green, who is in fact heading up a new office at NIST in research data and computing, is a member of the interest group. So at least she evidently is thinking in these terms, which is I take as a good sign. But I'm hoping to advocate for more. A bunch of research software engineering activities amongst our colleagues that I'm trying to get more involved in and getting us to help each other. So.
Okay, great, thank you. Maybe we can maybe you can encourage Gretchen to do the survey as well, just so we get any experiences that had already. Ilian, do you want to comment on your chat message as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's our job to help senior leaders recognize the value and sort of implement some fairness for the software projects we have. But ultimately, as I said in the message, it's in the funds, it's in the hands of the funders that need to impose certain terms for future research, so we achieve that sustainability. It's only very recent that my own institution started looking at it, even though we have had the best practices. I don't think we have thought about it at a level that we need some leadership that will take action. I'm talking about research software because otherwise, software companies already comply. They have, pay for ISO standards and so on. But in terms of research software, in academia and RTOs that are not software houses, it's a bit more difficult because we rely on competitive funding, and if the funders don't put the terms and conditions, we don't quite, implement the best practices needed to be fair enough for software. The situation is not great at people that produce data, like big facilities as well, but at least that data are more fair than the software we produce.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I guess I might say, just based on the comment you put in chat, which was ultimately it's in the hands of funders. I think that that's partly true, but I think there are certainly others that have a role to play as well, such as publishers and the institutions where people work that are evaluating people and others. So I think this isn't just funders, but I agree that funders have a significant role.
The major stakeholder is the funder, I would think.
Let's see, Moran, do you want to just comment on your addition in the chat as well?
Yes, thank you, Dan. I just wanted to share that we have developed the research software metadata guidelines that are based on the FAIR4RS software principles, but not only on that, because we are going beyond, and there's 7 different aspects, so not just findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. It goes beyond that, and if you didn't hear about that, you can check it out. And there's also a checklist, so it's more of an implementation than the principles.
Thank you. All right, so if anybody else has any comments that they want to make, we'll hold it for another minute, or well, probably not a whole minute, but a few more seconds, and then we'll wrap this up. Okay, so not seeing anybody else, again, from Moran and I, thank you very much for coming. We believe that the work that we did in the principles themselves was useful and has moved the community forward. We hope you agree, and we hope we can get your feedback in helping understand what else we might need to do. And again, to help circulate the survey, there will be another webinar that'll be December 5th or 6th, depending on your time, basically 10 hours later than this starting. So if there are people that couldn't make it, or for whom that would be a better time, please let them know as well. I think that's at the beginning of the survey as a description of where the webinars are, and we'll post the recording here as well in the beginning of the survey. Okay, thanks very much, and hope to hear from you through the survey or through any other means. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.